As painful, expensive as American engagement is in the world, the alternative is far worse. So that's, to me, the lesson I would learn from the 20th century. America needs to be engaged not just modestly, but robustly.
Today, one of the nation's foremost foreign policy thought leaders, Robert Wexler, weighs in. As the managing partner of Ballard Partners' Washington office, and former chair of the Middle East Subcommittee on House Foreign Relations, Wexler deciphers the new dynamics affecting peace in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, a newly aggressive China, and a highly nuclear Iran. Here from Ballard Studios, it's 13th and Park.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
We will make America strong again.
We will get through this together.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Today, Justin and I are thrilled to have Robert Wexler with us, former member of Congress, currently leads the Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace, a think tank that's looking for ways to bring tranquility and peace to the Middle East. Raised in South Florida, he's pro-Israel, pro-peace, and what I would say is pro-matzah, having read that you were really into the matzah pricing wars. Is that right, Robert?
It was very important in my district. People were paying like 5 times the amount of money for a box of matzah in South Florida versus New York. That is a scandal.
Well, I'll tell you, they recognize you now in every Seder in America, so thank you for that. Russ?
Yeah, and Robert also is one of our partners here at Ballard Partners as well, and so it's an honor to have you, one of our partners here at Ballard Partners, with us today.
Well, we can't wait to dive into it. And I think, Justin, let's start with the Middle East.
Sure. So, one of the signature accomplishments of the Trump administration in the Middle East were the Abraham Accords. And so now we have the Biden administration. And I guess the question becomes, can the historic nature of those Abraham Accords, can they be built upon or shaped to help align with U.S. interests moving forward in the Middle East?
The short answer is yes. The more complex answer is that the Abraham Accords were an extraordinary accomplishment, obviously creating normalization between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. The further challenge is essentially twofold. One, bring more countries into it, possibly Saudi Arabia, and then non-Arab countries like Pakistan, Indonesia, and others. And the other very complicated, but I would argue essential piece, is how to bring the Palestinians into this process in a way that both benefits them, is consistent with Israeli security interests, and allows the Palestinians entry into a process that so far has essentially been a pretty undignified element to their existence and relationship with their fellow Arab countries.
Do you think that Palestinian participation in the Abraham Accords will take place only after other nations, both Arab and non-Arab nations, join the Abraham Accords, or do you see that possibly happening before those other nations join?
Well, I think it's all, it's the language that should be used. I don't think Palestinians will ever agree to participate in the Abraham Accords, because remember, the Abraham Accords essentially undid the written and unwritten rule between the Palestinians and the Arab countries, meaning that the Arab countries would not normalize with Israel until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was resolved. It's not resolved. It's not going to be resolved in the near future. So the question is, how can the Palestinians benefit from this process, add some level of autonomy, sovereignty to them, add economic benefit to the Palestinians, but not undermine their claims for a state of their own.
So you've spent a lot of time in Israel. It's been publicly reported that you were considered to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel early in this administration. For those who follow Israeli politics, we're going to have the 5th parliamentary election this year in 2022 in the last 2.5 years. A striking number of elections in a very short period of time. Is this the future of Israeli democracy? Is this what we can expect going forward? And if so, what does that mean for the expansion of the Abraham Accords and for the larger Israel's relationship with the region?
Israel is a vibrant democracy, like America is a vibrant democracy, and like America, they too are divided along different lines than we are here in the United States. But it is in many ways a country, Israel, that leans very strongly to the right. However, there are other divides, religious versus secular. 80% largely Jewish, 20% Arab, and it works out to about half and half in terms of political allegiances. We will see. The election is November 1st. Former Prime Minister Netanyahu is making a very strong bid to be Prime Minister again. He'll likely either win or lose that attempt by just one or two votes in the parliament.
There's been a lot of news recently coming out of Qatar, not just the World Cup, which I hope we're all like primed for. I think it's going to make America a soccer nation again for about 4 weeks before we go back to football and everything else.
2 weeks.
Maybe you give it 2 weeks. So there was the death of a well-known cleric, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was living in Qatar, was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Union of Muslim Scholars, known by reputation, fairly or not, for preaching extremism, jihadism, etc. Does maybe the passing of this cleric and maybe others, could that usher in a whole nother opportunity for Qatar and other players in the Middle East, Robert, to kind of come together with the Abraham Accords and do something that, even a couple of years ago we thought was completely unthinkable?
The short answer is yes. As you rightly point out, his element of religiosity was strident. It promoted extremism. There's a reason why he was referred to as the sheikh of the terrorists. His fatwas encouraged suicide bombings and things of that nature. And his departure allows for more moderate, thoughtful religious leaders to preach the real Islam, which is, as I'm no expert, but as many people who practice the Islamic faith argue and proclaim, that it's a religion of peace. So let that win out and let their religious leaders promote that type of Islam, which will benefit not just the Middle East, but the whole world.
That's something I think the whole world could pray for. Let's switch gears a little bit, but not go too far. Let's go to Iran. Cue tape.
Iran has repeatedly denied that it is making a bomb and said sites like these produce energy, medical equipment, and scientific research.
Almost all of the technologies have a civilian nuclear energy component, but they also have a nuclear weapons component.
Robert, this nation had an agreement not long ago with Iran. That was we then turned 180 on under the Trump administration to try to stop the nuclearization of Iran, which I think should scare everybody. Is there a plan B if Iran continues now to march more in the direction of a nuclear nation that has, at least in its current core philosophy, some pretty scary aims?
Well, at this point, the likelihood of the Biden administration being able to reach some type of agreement with Iran to limit or end its nuclear weapon quest seems unlikely. That could change, though. I was just at a meeting earlier today where people argued that the protests in Iran might force the Iranian leadership to try to go back to the Iran agreement to change the subject and to gain some type of what would be false praise by the world, but some praise by the world. We should understand Iran seeks nuclear weapons. We should also understand that America and Israel cannot live in a world where Iran has a nuclear weapon. I don't want to live in that world, and I don't think any American should want to live in that world. So we have to have a plan B. To date, that has not been articulated by the American government. Frankly, going back and forth between our administrations, whether you favored the Iran nuclear agreement or not, is not a helpful element to our policy. Showing one administration flipping on another and then potentially flipping back, again, regardless of which way, doesn't help America.
But it looks like, yeah, from everything Justin and I were talking about this earlier, there's a real movement in Iran among women, pushing hopefully Iran into moderation and into modernity, where women who have been under kind of siege by, you might say, the cultural aspects that have been foisted on them in Iran, are protesting in massive numbers, leading to questions about whether or not the government can sustain itself in the face of this.
We should all pray and root for the success of those women and their allies, but at the same time, we should be mindful, eyes open, that the resoluteness of the Iranian leadership to, in essence, stamp out that type of protest will be as vigilant and as dangerous and as violent as they need to be. So I think it would be a bit naive to think that things are going to change that quickly in Iran, unfortunately.
It is unfortunate because at some point the government, even if they do put it down with violence, at some point the government continues to lose more and more legitimacy in the eyes of the people they govern. So final question for you is, tell us globally, what do you feel are the top 3 foreign policy issues for the United States in 2022?
The overriding number one issue, which is what it was when Biden took office and it will be for the coming years, is America's relationship with China. How do we compete with China? How do we confront China? How do we do all of that with a more aggressive China and not unsettle the economic markets and the equilibrium between China and our allies in Asia? Respectfully, I think the biggest mistake President Trump made was ripping up the Asia trade pact that President Obama entered into, because it was an excellent example of America using soft power, economic power, to our advantage versus China. The second would be, how does America as a superpower come out of the war between Russia and Ukraine and once again lead the world? People were beginning to think that NATO was maybe irrelevant. Maybe American leadership was a bit expendable or irrelevant. Well, people got a quick glimpse of what the alternative is. It's Putin. So we're not perfect here in the United States, but we're looking pretty damn good compared to Putin. So the question is, how do we build on that? How do we build our alliances in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East to confront a more aggressive Russia that gets more and more desperate? The third would be Iran, and how to stop it not just from becoming a nuclear power, but its non-nuclear activities are just as nefarious, just as unsettling. And we have an opportunity to join with Saudi Arabia, with our other Gulf allies, with Israel, and with the other moderate Sunni states to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon holder, and also from essentially unsettling the region. If we can accomplish that, then it would be a much safer world.
With all the threats that are in play, say major threats, you have a nuclearized Iran, you have the leader of North Korea, who scares the heck out of just about any, sane person. And then you have, of course, Vladimir Putin, who likes to wave the nuclear threat. What of those three or something else keeps you awake at night?
Well, they all keep me awake, but I think what we have to concentrate on is not building perfect coalitions, but working with our partners that share our interests, and stop seeking the perfect partners. We have to work with countries like Turkey. We're going to have to work with Saudi Arabia. MBS is likely to be around for 4 or 5 decades. We need to figure out that proper balance between human rights and pursuing our national security interests. If we do that, then I think we succeed. If we get sidetracked, that's when that keeps me up at night.
And just one final question. I was at a reception hosted by the American Swiss Foundation at the Swiss ambassador of the U.S. Home and embassy or home residence in Washington last night, and one of the people there kind of had a very provocative statement, and I'm still thinking about it. Said that if you like the 20th century, you're really going to like the 21st century, and this was kind of said half in jest. And the thesis was that for all the bad things that happened in the 20th century, the 21st century could actually be worse. I'm curious, how do you feel globally about the 21st century, given the trends that we see taking place now in 2022?
Well, I think that's a good admonition that the person at the Swiss embassy said, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. And I think one of the lessons that we should learn from the 20th century, we as Americans, is that when America withdraws, as attractive as it often is to withdraw, the vacuum that is created, much more likely than not, will be filled by actors that don't share our interests. So as painful, expensive as American engagement is in the world, the alternative is far worse. So that's, to me, the lesson I would learn from the 20th century. America needs to be engaged not just modestly, but robustly. And we should learn our lessons. We should be humble. We shouldn't go into wars just to go into wars. But if we have to use our military, use it and then get out as quickly as possible. But don't become isolationist. That's the biggest risk that we face.
Robert Wexler, thank you for your time, your wisdom, and for your service.
My pleasure.
We really appreciate it. I know now that I've got a lot to study up on because I've been too focused on domestic policy. It's time for me to broaden my perspective.
Great. Thank you, Robert. It's been an honor having you with us.
Thank you.
So, Justin, this was an encyclopedic lesson on foreign policy.
Well, it's just Robert Wexler, one of the most learned, thoughtful people, not just on Middle Eastern politics and policy, but global policy as well. And I think we really got in our very short time with him, we got a sense of the depth of thinking that he's had over the years as a member of Congress, member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and now in his post-public service role.
Well, he talked a lot about making sure America doesn't fall into isolationism, right? And not us first kind of thing. And certainly the Biden administration has engaged the world very broadly. I think he made very compelling points that if we want to make a real difference in the Middle East, in taming the Iranian threat, in dealing with China, we can't do it from Washington, D.C.,
right.
We've got to really get out there and be a part of the world community.
Yeah, and but this is a tension. For those who studied American history know that this has always been a tension throughout the history from the beginning of the Republic, from George Washington not wanting to get involved in the affairs of Europe as a new nation, all the way to strands of isolationism through the 20th century, and now we have it in the 21st century. So this is not a new phenomenon, a new problem, but I think that the challenges that the world presents to the U.S. now cry out for leadership. And I think Robert's point was, if the U.S. doesn't lead, others whose interests are against the U.S. Interests will fill that void and fill that gap. So it's an art for those who lead this country, members of Congress, and for Joe Biden and the current administration, any presidential administration, to balance that strain of isolationism that will always be present in U.S. politics with America's need to engage and lead the world.
It's interesting, too, when he talked about Saudi Arabia and Israel. There's kind of they call it a secretive relationship where they do a lot of things, especially on the security front, without really sharing it with the rest of the world, how that would be the ultimate opening. But the problem, of course, is you still have Pakistan, very nuclearized. You have Algeria, which is the largest Arab population outside of the Middle East. And you've got the threat of powers that don't want there to be peace.
Right. So it's again, the Abraham Accords were really an earthquake in Middle Eastern politics. It was the first step of a long journey, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I think with time, you might have 2 steps forward, 1 step back, maybe what's happened in Iraq. But there is progress, and there is progress being made. So at some point, Saudi Arabia will join at some point. I believe that. At some point, hopefully Pakistan will, and others will as well. And I think that kind of one interesting talking about Saudi Arabia is one philosophy that he had about American foreign policy is not looking for the perfect partners, but for looking for good partners. And, he said it's a world where we're not always going to be able to have perfect partners to accomplish American objectives and to fulfill America's interests around the world. And I thought that was a very pragmatic point for him to make.
Now, do you mind me getting personal for a second? How do you get invited to the Swiss embassy? When you told the story about the Swiss embassy,
you like how I dropped that in there?
It was brilliant, and I was thinking, okay, that's a very substantive question for Robert.
Right.
That's good intellectually. Emotionally, I thought, why am I not on that list?
Well, I have to thank the Swiss ambassador for inviting me and the American Swiss Foundation. I participated in the Young Leaders program with the American Swiss Foundation in 2008. I spent a week in Geneva, Switzerland there with 25 Americans, 25 Swiss were there. We met with leaders in the government. We talked about foreign policy issues, learned a lot about the important work that Switzerland does in global affairs.
I can imagine.
Because they're obviously historically been a neutral country, and they help countries talk to each other like they help back-channel communications at different points in the time between the U.S. government and the Iranian government, because for a certain period of time there were no we've had a history of not having official diplomatic relations with Iran and other countries. So they hosted this event, and this comment has really stuck with me that was made by one of the speakers there. They had a little mini discussion there about this person had a very dark view of what the 20th century would bring, thought that that we're headed in this century towards global conflict. Part of it was centered on climate change and the impacts that climate change will have, but obviously the impact of technology, looking at what's happening in Europe now with Ukraine, et cetera. So that's the answer to the question, and it was a fascinating conversation. There were a number of journalists there and other diplomats that were there. But these are questions that I'm glad we're addressing them as part of our podcast. They're not the sexiest issues. They maybe don't get a ton of attention, but they are important to the security of our country and the economic success of our country as well.
Well, I'll tell you, I really like the story we talked about the Iranian women who have risen up and said enough. All the things that scare you out there, that's something that hardens you. Now, just for the record, you didn't answer how I get on the list for the Swiss embassy.
I'll see what I can do.
Okay. Okay. Great to be with you again. Another great, conversation with someone that really knows his stuff. And I think, in foreign policy, which tends to be a foreign substance for most people, it was really nice to hear from Robert and to get that perspective.
It's hard to get anyone better. He was a great guest, and thanks everyone for joining. For those of us who lived in Florida for some time, we've all experienced hurricanes. And our hearts and prayers go out to those who have been negatively affected by the devastating Hurricane Ian. There is a fund that's been set up to help those in need by the state of Florida. First Lady Casey DeSantis announced that the Florida Disaster Fund has now been activated. If you would like to contribute and help those in need, you can do so by texting the word disaster to 20222. That's text the word disaster to 20222. Please consider making a donation, and thanks again for joining us on 13th and Park.